Welcome to Fiction and the Fantastic, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Marina Warner, and I'm talking with Adam Thirlwell. We're both writers of fiction and cultural criticism and long-time contributors to the LRB. In this, the last of our conversations together, we're exploring a work with which we could have started, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, first published in 1818. It's a foundational work of the fantastic, as Gothic, as sci-fi, as trauma narrative. And it's also the progenitor of many other works in a variety of media. It's by far the most popular and well-known and most famous of the works we have read together so far. Adam, I found it very difficult to look at Frankenstein with an open mind, as it were, because my mind was so full of images from the way it's been interpreted. Can you tell us what kind of book it is?
Absolutely, yeah, it's true, because it's become such a famous name and so famous in the genre of the horror film that it's now almost very difficult to kind of come to it again to read it as a book. It sets itself up as a highly realist story. It sets itself up almost within the epistolary tradition. So you get the opening is a letter or a series of letters from a man called Walton, Captain Walton, who essentially has traveled to the north. I think he's first in St. Petersburg to find the Northwest Passage and also the magnetic north. So he's an explorer, he's a scientist, and he is filled with a very quasi-romantic sense of destiny, and that a true kind of man of science will do these daring exploits and will find the secrets of nature. Then gradually what happens is he sees the monster driving at a huge distance away in a sled. And he can make out that there is something kind of monstrously large about this figure, even at that distance. And then later on, he meets essentially a kind of half-dead figure of this other scientist called Frankenstein. And the emaciated Frankenstein then proceeds to tell him his story, so that we therefore have a story within a story. And then actually we will get other stories within the story. And most crucially, the monster himself will speak. And almost the most, I would say, the kind of heart of the novel is actually the monster's narrative, which comes pretty much at the kind of dead center of the novel. So, like a lot of these books we've been talking about, fascinatingly, within the fantastic, it's also desperate to assert itself as real, with all this paraphernalia of the letters and the narratives. And we're told that there is evidence as well that, these letters have survived. So Captain Walton says, even however kind of ludicrous this tale may seem, I've seen the letters, I can attest to the kind of evidence.
The various things arise from this relationship, don't they? I mean, first of all, they're very much doubles, because Walton is pursuing knowledge in the way that Frankenstein, when he was young, pursues knowledge, which then ultimately leads to his reanimation of these elements that he manages to turn into a living being. But also there's this ice, there's this amazing landscape, extraordinary kind of hallucinatory images of ice rafts and ice flows.
It's true. So we're somewhere essentially near the North Pole, as far as we can tell. And the ice there mirrors the ice of the Alps, which is where a lot of the central action of the story within the story takes place. So it's true that this whole narrative is a highly northern narrative, that it somehow equates the barrenness of ice and the terror of ice with the search for knowledge, and potentially with an admonition not to search for knowledge. So
the extremes, the extreme ends of the earth. They mirror the extreme ends of her imagination, Mary Shelley's imagination.
And I think it's important to say that she was very young when she wrote this book. Although she actually lived relatively long, her life has a kind of very strange shape in that she was incredibly young when she basically ran away with Shelley.
16, I think.
She was 16 or 17.
Met him when she was 16. Yes.
And she was this daughter of sort of literary royalty. She was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. And then met Shelley, and basically when he was married, and they eloped together. Well, not even eloped because they weren't. They ran away
with her sister, her half sister.
With her half sister, Claire Claremont. And so there's something. And then one of the things I think that we might come back to, but what's very interesting in this biography is that she had already lost one child who was born prematurely. She'd already then had another child. And so this story that's all about birth and death, it's fascinating that even though she was, by the time she wrote this, I think she was 19 when she wrote it, she had actually already experienced like large extremes of human experience. And then after the publication of the novel, and it's quite interesting also to think that at the time when they were together, Shelley, I think, was the far less successful writer. So in the same year as she published Frankenstein, he published The Revolt of Islam, which passed utterly unnoticed. So there's something quite interesting about that too.
But when you said that they were literary royalty is perhaps not the mot juste.
No, it's quite the absolutely wrong.
Because they were absolute famous dissidents and radicals.
They were, exactly.
And William Godwin, her father, was much ostracized.
Yes. And also they didn't believe it. There's something with common to all radicals when it's actually in their own family. They rather dislike radical behavior. So although Godwin and Wollstonecraft had been militantly against marriage, Godwin then very much got angry when the married Shelley is running away with his own daughter, which I find quite funny.
But also Shelley was attracted to Godwin on political grounds. I mean, they were soulmates in terms of atheism,
exactly.
For which Shelley had been expelled from Oxford.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's interesting about the book to talk about later is how far this is truly a supernatural book and how far this is an atheist book, and also I think how politically radical it is or not, because I think certainly in some ways, Mary Shelley, certainly by the end of her life, did not share Percy Shelley's radical views.
I mean, she couched it as a dream. She wrote an introduction to, I think, the second edition, in which she spoke very eloquently about the inner world that she had experienced. I mean, she doesn't attach it to outer experiences. She says that it's to do with her dream life. And it came to her, she said, in a dream. So that has roots in a way rather different from the very rationalist feel of the book.
Exactly. I mean, so there's this, I think what's interesting about this book is that it's a creation myth in many ways. And actually the creation of the novel itself has become its own creation myth. So that famously, she and Shelley were living by Lake Geneva with Barton, who they had basically hooked up with, partly because Claire Claremont, Mary's half-sister, was pursuing an affair with him and wanted to kind of hang out with him more. And it was raining incessantly. And the reason for this, I'm not even sure they knew this, was that Mount Tambora in Indonesia had the year before erupted in, I think it's the largest explosion ever seen in the Holocene. And so a huge cloud of ash had basically caused major ecological changes, so that the winter before had been known as the winter of ice, where it was intolerably cold. And then there was no summer, that it just rained and rained and rained. And so there they were stuck in this villa, and so one evening, to amuse themselves, they decided they would make up what they were called ghost stories.
I think Barton set it as a competition.
Yeah. And Mary describes basically in her preface that she felt in some way inadequate, that here she was with these famous writers or brilliant writers, and they were coming up with ideas and she couldn't think of anything. And then she basically says that another conversation they'd been having, which had been about galvanism, the kind of latest science of electricity and whether it might be possible to revivify something that was dead, occupied her mind. And so she had this vision, which became one of the early chapters of the novel. And so she woke up and realized that this image that had terrified her could be the ghost story that she'd been trying to write.
Do you want to read that bit? I mean, I think it is very interesting that a novel with so many political and metaphysical and rational thinking has its roots in a dream.
Yeah, here we go. So this is from her introduction, which she wrote many years later in 1831. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the workings of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. And then she goes on and says, I opened my eyes in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. I see them still, the very room, the dark parquet, the closed shutters with the moonlight struggling through, and the sense I had that the glassy lake and white high Alps were beyond. It's an amazing description.
Yes.
And it's interesting that, again, the Alps, the glassy lake and the kind of the white Alps, which plays such a part in the
She
narrative.
places some emphasis there on God, the creator, which is thought to be by her people who've commented on her with more knowledge than I have, that the 1831 edition she created has more observance of the Christian frame than the first one she wrote. So let's go to the actual making of the creature.
Yeah.
Because he's never named.
Exactly.
That's
so
extreme.
The monster is, you can call him the monster, the creature. I remember there was actually in 1825, because it was such a popular novel that it was almost immediately adapted for the stage. So in 1825, the stage adaptation was actually called Presumption. And a lovely fact is that in the playbill, the monster's name was just dashes. It was just a series of dashes. So it was unnameable even in a cast list.
Yes.
And so the Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, which is obviously a name with a lot of presumptuous connotations, is an extraordinary scientist. He's someone who ever since a child has wanted to know, well, I think he calls this the secrets of nature. And he goes to university where he studies chemistry and becomes more and more interested in this question of what the principle of life might be, what it is that makes some things alive and other things not, and then whether it might be possible to bring back to life something that's dead. And he says that suddenly, and it's never explained how, this is a very common, I think, aspect to the supernatural, that there'll be one glitch, as it were, in lots of these stories we've been talking about, where the truly supernatural moment has to be elided because it's impossible to describe. So in some way that we're never quite told, he happens on the secret of life and then sets about this project he decides he's going to create something essentially from limbs of the dead.
It's not as clear in the book as it is in the films.
Yeah.
I mean, and also in the sort of general attitude to the 18th century, we think of, the people digging up graves, the resurrection men, and the early 19th century, the sort of terror of the walking dead. So that's really being grafted on, because the actual description, I mean, he at some point we know that Frankenstein is exploring the dank hollows of the earth, or...
Yeah, it's interesting because it says that he does have to enter charnel houses.
Yes.
He was forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses, and that he beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. But it's true that it's not obvious what he's doing.
That's a very writerly thing to do, to leave it to our vivid and overwrought imaginations to see the horror of it.
And then it just says, this is Frankenstein speaking, after days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter.
Yes, because later, when he begins to make a mate for the creature, the bride of Frankenstein, as it were, there's no sense. He goes to the Orkneys, and there's no sense that he's no longer kind of scrabbling in cemeteries or animal parts. He's just doing it. He's assembling almost like an artist, a picture of a person, which he then destroys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I guess, it's thinking about what you were saying about kind of religion, is that it seems an entirely irreligious world, basically, and that Frankenstein doesn't see any religious reason why he should not be pursuing these scientific.
It's also a material world. I mean, it's very, very rooted in 18th century philosophy.
Yeah.
It's very la maîtrise, or, the idea of, or do animals have souls? I mean, this sort of very strict materialism, because he begins by pursuing studies of the occult and esotericism. He studies Paracelsus, and they're not rationalists. They believe in a spiritual side. They believe in magic.
Yeah.
There will be something beyond the palpable or the apprehensible, something one could reach, some wisdom, some deep wisdom. And that Frankenstein sets aside. He then becomes a sort of pure rationalist. He's working with matter. It's the secret of matter that he finds.
We don't really know exactly when Mary Shelley thinks this book is set. All we know is it's in the 18th century, not the 19th, because the first letters are dated from 17-something, but we never see the rest of the date. And it's clearly a world that is sort of believes itself to have superseded magic. But what is interesting is that in Frankenstein, in his conversations with his tutors at his university, finds one who does say, doesn't deride him for reading Agrippa and people like that, but does actually say, yes, they were the kind of forerunners in some sense. They were the precursors of modern science. So they actually see it as a continuum, whereas other tutors think it's laughable that he should have ever read these essentially alchemists. And there's a lot of kind of mention of alchemy.
Yes. I mean, he is a Faustian figure.
Yeah.
There's a sense, though there's no devil, there's no temptation, there's just his inner, he's impelled to learn and to be knowledgeable. But he is, in a sense, a Faustian figure. She's portrayed him as somebody who is completely ignores any. I mean, his father doesn't want him to pursue these studies, and he loves his father, but he absolutely goes on impelled to do it.
Yeah, and I think you're meant to think that in some way, the question of whether he's already possessed is a very interesting one. But again, it's not from an outside tempter. So there's no Satan or Mephistopheles in this. It's purely of his own volition that he has.
It's very different from the
this
James Hogg.
Yeah.
Where there's a definite outside figure
Exactly.
who takes possession.
Here there is no outside figure, but it's interesting as well that
because the dates are not so different. I mean,
no, they're very close actually, aren't they? But I think what's kind of strange is that there's a very interesting moment when he, in his essentially kind of madness, when he says, he was making this being in some unspecified way and that it was going to be very beautiful. And it's only after it kind of wakes up that you suddenly get this actual physical description.
Yes, do read.
And what's interesting is you basically realize that in a sense he's gone mad because he suddenly sees what he actually looks like. So this is chapter 5, which is interesting that in her introduction she says that her first sentence she wrote began, "It was on a dreary night of November." And this is how chapter 5 begins. "It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils." And then he says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion, and straight black lips." So in some way he's been in a fugue state, it seems, unable to see what it was that he was creating.
And this instant repulsion that he feels, this kind of vision of death that assaults him, leads to the appalling rejection of the creature.
Exactly.
And then to the whole of the rest of the disaster of his coming into the world.
Yeah, so what's kind of fascinating about this story, I think, is that there is both the story of, as it were, illicit creation, of going too far scientifically and creating something where maybe you shouldn't have done. But then really the driver of the narrative becomes Frankenstein's repulsion at what he is, not necessarily what he has done, but specifically at the creature that is too ugly. And it becomes then a very interesting, I think one of the reasons why it's become so powerful is because then you get, I think, very primal feelings evoked by it that go psychoanalytically, as it were, to issues of mothering, of parenting, of almost postnatal depression, up through because one of the texts that it clearly is in dialogue with is Paradise Lost, so that the epigraph to the novel is taken from book 10 of Paradise Lost, where Adam basically, after the fall, has a kind of lapse and kind of just moans about how this is too unfair. Like, why would you create someone if you were then going to condemn them to such an unhappy life?
I think one of the words that I think Mary Shelley innovates, I don't think it's before her, maybe it was, but is compassionate. This verb, this transitive verb, "Please compassionate me," says the monster.
Exactly.
And the whole emotional depth of the book is invested in the creature's tragic sense of alienation and separation from the world. And we see him survive in some mysterious... He's preternaturally strong and very
and he's
swift.
Also 8 foot tall. It's again very strange to think. So Frankenstein seems surprised by this, when in fact he's been the person making this creature. Yeah, and so the monster has to survive because he's abandoned entirely by Frankenstein. And there's this very beautiful section of the novel where he basically finds a kind of abandoned sty next to a very frugal but clean cottage, which is inhabited, we discover, by some almost like from characters from a fairy tale who have suffered terrible injustice and are now living in kind of noble poverty in this cottage.
And rather learned. I mean, they're very
learned, and they clearly read to each other at night. And so it's a father and a brother and a sister. And the monster watches them, and through this, he extraordinarily learns how to speak. He learns how to read and write, and also he learns, what for him would be the beauty of human company, as it were, which he seems to be cut out from. And so the father is blind, and so he thinks what he should do is go and talk first to the father, because he's aware that his own appearance, he's already
been shunned by
people, even when he saved them from death in the mountains. As soon as people see his appearance, they try and shoot him. And so in another fairy tale that comes to mind is like Beauty and the Beast. It's very much about this kind of tradition, this fairy tale tradition of where if only you could see past the appearance, you would realize that a very noble, beautiful soul is within, and nobody can.
Yes, because he's then, when the young people of the family come back, the old man has spoken to him kindly because he can't see him.
Exactly.
But immediately Felix, so named, happy, comes back in. He again rejects him and absolutely repulses him.
And then they immediately leave the next day because they're so frightened of this terrifying monster.
So there's a tremendous, this strong strand of the agony of not belonging, of anguish, of being a pariah.
Exactly. And what then, I think it's interesting because you're trying to determine how radical or not Mary Shelley is, because certainly in a similar way, I guess, to how Milton seems in many ways actually more imaginatively excited by the satanic kind of aspect of his story, I think there are major signs that in many ways the much more sympathetic character and complicated character is the monster, and that Mary Shelley's imaginative energy, however much she tries to obfuscate that, does seem to be with the monster.
I mean, she also uses him as the vehicle to express her ideas, which are also her father Godwin's ideas and to some extent Shelley's ideas, about the malleability of human nature, that we're not born in sin. It's a rejection of the idea of original sin. We're born good. All these ideas come from Rousseau, really. And we're vitiated by social structures, by hierarchy, by conventions, by power. And the monster is, in a sense, that's exactly what happens to him. I mean, he begins good, he's rejected, but it isn't the psychological wound, it's actually the social wound that prevents him, and he becomes actually monstrous, he becomes evil.
Yeah, and he vows to take revenge, I think, in quite a wonderfully dramatic passage, which we might read a little of. And so after he's rejected by this family, and he also has discovered, I think one thing to discuss at some point as well is within this novel that is quite a lot of pains to try and be a realist novel in one sense. There are many moments of highly unlikely kind of plotting that I don't
Which was criticised, actually.
Yeah, that, as it were, Jane Austen would not have allowed. Yes, no. And one of them is that, amazingly, the monster finds all of Frankenstein's lab notes in his pocket that somehow Frankenstein has left there, so he can therefore read the entire story, as it were, of his creation and also of his rejection by Frankenstein.
Well, of course, there's no verisimilitude at all in the dialogue.
No.
I mean, there's these long, long tracts of description, and as you said earlier, they're set within, these are reported speech. I mean, this is being told by someone to somebody about what the creature said about himself. And there's no verisimilitude at all. And also they do speak in the similar Mary Shelley kind of language.
Yeah. It's a very romantic, almost Miltonic. Yeah. It very much sounds as if essentially one, like the kind of language that's being used by her poet friends, as it's got a kind of Byronic, Shelleyan tone to it. And so this is how the monster reacts after being rejected by this family. Cursed, cursed creator, why did I live? Why, in that instant, did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I know not. Despair had not yet taken possession of me. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. When night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered in the wood, and now, no longer restrained by the fear of discovery, I gave vent to my anguish in fearful howlings. I was like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me and ranging through the wood with a stag-like swiftness. Oh, what a miserable night I passed! The cold stars shone in mockery, and the bare trees waved their branches above me. Now and then the sweet voice of a bird burst forth amidst the universal stillness. All save I were at rest or in enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin.
Actually, when you read it, it makes me realize that, in a sense, the creature has learned about evil from hearing Paradise Lost read in the cottage.
He's found a copy of Paradise Lost as well.
Yes.
So he's both heard it read and then has read it himself.
And he's now absorbed this vision of the world as dualist, and whereas before he only knew his yearnings, his sympathetic yearnings.
No, exactly. And there's a very beautiful passage where she describes basically, the monster describes essentially coming to consciousness. And it seems to me like a wonderful evocation of what it must be like to be a baby, where he just describes how all his senses are intermingled, and he can't really tell kind of one from the other, and that life around him is just a sort of sequence of sensations that he can't interpret. And so it's a beautiful way of describing exactly what you were just saying, this kind of Rousseauian idea of the soul's essential innocence, that, when he's born, he's a Lockean tabula rasa. He's simply imbibing these sense impressions, and certainly with no sense of evil, and assumes that everyone will kind of take him in. And in fact, I think it's only through listening to the story of the DeLaces that of how, in an incredibly complicated and involved way, they have been rejected, that they've been tricked, and kind of the corrupt governments have been persecuting them. So he learns that humans may not be welcoming, as it were, to everybody. So he learns that there is such a thing as corruption, but on his own, he would not have known that.
The laces seen through the cottage window also represent for him a happy family, which in a way, his rejection by Frankenstein is definitely a paternal rejection, or even a maternal rejection. I mean, Frankenstein is both mother and father to him. He's generated by one person only, and he's utterly rejected. And there are scenes in which he pleads for Frankenstein's love. I mean, there's that wonderful sequence. I don't know if it comes before the bit you read or after, when he says, "O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice, and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous."
It's incredibly moving, actually.
Yes.
And I think so then the sort of plot complication that comes in is that the monster has ended up near Geneva. And I think he's gone there because he knows that that's where Frankenstein is from. So he doesn't really know how he will ever find Frankenstein, but he kind of wishes to be near the place that he believes his creator might be. So Frankenstein himself has also a kind of interestingly blended family. So he has an adoptive sister whom everyone wishes him to marry. So there's a strangely incestuous,
very incestuous, yes,
relationship there. And then he has two younger brothers. And one of them is called William, which I think very upsettingly was the name that Mary Shelley had given her own child, who was alive at the time, but who did subsequently die 2 or 3 years later. And the monster happens on William playing on his own in the mountains. And in some way just can't cope with this. Is just after he's realized his rejection, and so he can't cope with this image, I suppose, of happiness. And so he describes how he just strangles this young boy. We might read it because it's a genuinely shocking.
Yes. Well, the little boy rejects him as well, and
yes.
He tells him his name is Frankenstein, which of course.
Oh yeah, so this is what enrages him. So again, it's another image of being rejected. So he says, this is the monster again. "At this time, a slight sleep relieved me from the pain of reflection, which was disturbed by the approach of a beautiful child who came running into the recess I had chosen with all the sportiveness of infancy. Suddenly, as I gazed on him, an idea seized me that this little creature was unprejudiced, and had lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. If, therefore, I could seize him and educate him as my companion and friend, I should not be so desolate in this peopled earth. Urged by this impulse, I seized on the boy as he passed and drew him towards me. As soon as he beheld my form, he placed his hands before his eyes and uttered a shrill scream. I drew his hand forcibly from his face and said, 'Child, what is the meaning of this? I do not intend to hurt you. Listen to me.' He struggled violently. 'Let me go,' he cried. 'Monster, ugly wretch. You wish to eat me and tear me to pieces. You are an ogre. Let me go, or I will tell my papa. Boy, you will never see your father again. You must come with me. Hideous monster, let me go. My papa is a syndic. He is Monsieur Frankenstein. He will punish you. You dare not keep me. Frankenstein, you belong then to my enemy, to him towards whom I have sworn eternal revenge. You shall be my first victim. The child still struggled, and loaded with epithets which carried despair to my heart. I grasped his throat to silence him, and in a moment he lay dead at my feet.
Yeah. It also shows, that scene shows the power of fairy tales. Here we have a fantasy, the ogre, realized in a child's terror, which is, a very sobering thought. That the imagination matters. The way things are portrayed will give, he could have been unprejudiced. Children don't show kind of racial prejudice when they're young. They're taught it.
It's a very sad episode precisely because this dream of finding the unprejudiced turns out, I think William is 7 at the time or something like that. So even in a 7-year-old, the idea is that his ugliness precludes any kind of fellow feeling on the part of the boy.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.